Stranger Things thinks that you, yes, you, are a fucking idiot, and they've made that feeling very clear with the later seasons of the show and their crippling reliance on expositional dialogue. And this isn't just a problem for Stranger Things, it's a problem with Netflix as a whole, and not even just Netflix, but all major studios. And when I say expositional dialogue, I'm not talking about the subtle kind that sneaks information into important character moments, but instead the blunt, mechanical variety, where characters exist primarily to explain the plot. Conversations no longer flow. The characters feel like they're just waiting their turn to talk. They deliver their assigned information, then they step aside for the next speaker to repeat what was just said, and then a third character rephrases what was just said for a second time, and then a fourth restates what we've now heard 3 times with an emotional emphasis to tell us not only what's happening, but how we should feel about it. Now, let me be super clear. I really like Stranger Things. I like it a lot. I'm a day one fan, and despite me feeling like the show really began to insist upon itself,
it insists upon itself,
I still did really enjoy season 5. So this isn't a hate video on Stranger Things. It's more of a hate video on the current media landscape and how the guys in the suits are ruining movies and television. Stranger Things fell victim to the same issues that we've seen with Star Wars and Marvel. It became less about the characters and their coming of age story that was superimposed on this classic 80s style science fiction horror, and instead by season 4 of Stranger Things, it really began to feel like it was just about Stranger Things. Now, what does that mean when a show becomes about itself? Well, take Star Wars, for example. It used to be about the story of good and evil and fantasy and adventure and coming of age, but now Star Wars is really just about Star Wars. A lot of the new projects, Andor excluded, they no longer reference the psychological motifs of the human existence to tell their story, but instead they just started referencing themselves. They started referencing their own lore. In a meta way, Star Wars became self-aware of its own existence, and that bleeds through into the new movies and shows. And the same is true for Marvel. It became less about the characters and the heroes being heroes, and it moved into being about, hey, this is a Marvel, you like Marvel, and this Marvel has a reference to that other Marvel. So that's my first complaint with the direction that Stranger Things has gone. It became a series that no longer borrowed from the world around it, but instead borrowed from itself. But my main complaint with the later seasons and new shows and movies in general is the atrocious dialogue and exposition dumps. Studios have lost all faith in the audience having any media literacy or reading comprehension skills. And even more so, the studios have lost faith in the audience's ability to sit and watch a show or movie without looking at their phone. And the result has been a mandate for dialogue that feels unnatural and just over-explained. I mean, that is a literal mandate at Netflix that they put out, that when a Netflix writer is writing a show for Netflix, that they need to write it in a way that the show can be watched and understood without having to actually pay attention or look at the screen. And look, exposition is not inherently bad. In science fiction and horror, it's often unavoidable and it's a super important part of the project itself. I mean, you have to explain the rules and the complex nature of the fantasy fiction that's unfolding. But the problem with Stranger Things and many other shows is that exposition has become its primary mode of communication. Instead of showing, they're just doing a lot of telling. Most scenes follow the same rigid pattern just over and over again. A character enters with information, another character asks a perfectly phrased question, and then the first character responds with a clean, complete explanation. Everyone nods in agreement, and then someone else repeats for clarity what we all have already understood since the guy walked in the room. Again, they are telling instead of showing, and the audience just is no longer trusted to connect the dots. The show instead connects them for you out loud. And that's where the dialogue really starts to feel off. Real people interrupt each other. They misunderstand each other. They talk past each other and over each other. In Stranger Things, especially season 5, characters speak in these pristine paragraphs, politely waiting their turn, like everyone has agreed ahead of time to respect the sanctity of this expositional scene. Now, what's wild is that this issue does kind of go all the way back to season 1, specifically back to episode 5, The Flea and the Acrobat. In that episode, we see Mr. Clark explaining the Upside Down, and his use of the flea and the acrobat analogy is pure exposition. And that scene really only exists solely to explain the parallel dimension and overlapping reality realities and what the upside down is, because up until that point in the show, it had been kind of a mystery, and that was fun. But then when they really did need the audience to, understand, they needed to make sure that the audience understood what was going on to a certain extent, they had a scene where they explained it. But here's the difference. It feels very natural. That scene just flows. And that's because, one, it's brief, two, it's charming, and three, it is filtered through childlike curiosity that fits with the characters, the kids themselves. This is a natural conversation that they would be having. And the scene overall, it just doesn't overstay its welcome. And that is why it worked. But it also established a template that the show really never lets go of, characters existing primarily to prompt explanations. As the mythology of Stranger Things grew and became more complex, that template turned from a useful tool to a crutch. Instead of finding new ways to communicate information to the audience, the show just explained harder. By season 2, exposition stopped being isolated and it started becoming repetitive. And from roughly episode 203 through 205, we hear the same information about Will and what he's seeing and how the upside down is spreading and why his drawings matter. And it's all explained just again and again and again. Joyce explains it, Hopper explains it, doctors explain it, and they often are using like nearly identical phrasing in their redundant explanations. Scenes stop feeling like progression and start feeling like recaps. The show no longer trusted the audience to track Will's experience without the constant verbal reinforcement of what was happening moment to moment. It feels like the show was just holding our hand through the whole thing to make sure that we don't get lost. And quite frankly, it's annoying. Now, season 3 is where things really began to tip over. Once the Russian base under the mall is introduced, the show enters this near constant explanation mode. Dustin explains Cerebro. Robin translates Russian dialogue while narrating its meaning as it's happening. Characters repeatedly restate where the base is, why it exists, and what the machine does while actively interacting with it. And then you have lines like, so the Russians are trying to open the gate. Again, here, under the mall. They don't sound like people talking. They sound like a plot synopsis being read aloud. The characters, they stop reacting like people in danger and they start behaving like narrators, making sure that no one is confused. And then season 4 is where the problem really just metastasized. Vecna, he is introduced and turns out, oh, he's been there all along. Suddenly the show became obsessed with rules and explaining those rules over and over and over. Characters would gather around whiteboards and around tables and explain like systems of how everything's working to the audience. And it's a lot of stuff that we already understood. Multiple groups are separated physically by geography, but they are independently restating the same information over and over. And then all of this culminates in Vecna's extended monologue at the end of the season in the finale at the exact moment where tension should be peak, and the show just like hits pause so the villain can explain his childhood and his philosophy, his transformation, and his evil plan.
I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
And this is all on top of season 4 actually doing the right thing and showing us like a shit ton of flashbacks already. A huge part of this season was 11 reliving her own life so that we as the audience could be filled in on those missing parts of the story. And that's great. Just do that. We got it. You don't have to explain it 50 times. And then season 5, oh my, I swear, okay, look, I swear I like this show. It doesn't sound like it, but I'm getting a little ranty. Season 5. I enjoyed it, but oh my God, this exposition stuff got so bad that it became a TikTok trend.
Then we know that between the two would be a wormhole, and bingo was her name-o.
So look, again, I really like Stranger Things. I hope they do more of it, let it rest for a little while, but then do some more. I think there were rumblings of like a Nancy something, but then I think that turned out to be a book. I don't know. I'm all for them maybe doing like an 11 series, like her living her life in hiding. I think that would be cool. I just really hope that Stranger Things, Netflix overall, and just movie making and TV show making industry will regain a little faith in the audience and stop making stuff that is, to be watched while we're scrolling our phones or doing dishes or whatever. And look, there is a time and place for that kind of content. I think reality TV is a great thing for, having on some background noise that you can look away from the screen and still like do other stuff. But that's not the point of a show like Stranger Things. That's not the point of like a narrative storytelling type show. Stranger Things and shows like it, you gotta cut the exposition, man. You gotta cut. And look, now here I am over explaining my point. I'm gonna go. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on all of that down in the comments below. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell. I've been Colton Ogburn. I'll see you next time. Bye.